hi, Sonali. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to hear about your journey and your story as we celebrate South Asian Heritage Month. So before joining Simmons, you began your career and your life really in Sri Lanka. So could you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Sure. Thank you, Bandy. Lovely to chat with you. So I was born and raised in Sri Lanka, as you said, the commercial capital, Colombo, and very much grew up in a quite strict, traditional South Asian household. I had 13 years of convent education. So it was quite a curious experience with nuns ruling your world. I used to remember this. They used to say, girls, you should always align yourself or apply yourself like swans, graceful demeanor on the outside, but paddling like crazy underwater. So that experience really was formative for sure, secondary education in Sri Lanka. I didn't have the easiest of childhoods. I lost both my parents to cancer in my teenage years. And that, as you can imagine, shaped my world. But it taught me some key life lessons. The first was a robust resilience to whatever came my way. And the second, I would say, is an appreciation of how precious and yet fragile life can be, and how we must live life to the fullest and also with purpose. And I try and use those lessons to the best I can, even to this day. Why I became a lawyer? Well, it was very much accidental, I would say. So after leaving school, my ambition or aspiration really was to join the Foreign Service and the Diplomatic Corps. And I was waiting to get to university in Colombo, but there was a 2-year backlog. So to mark my time, I did the local bar exam. Qualified, rather enjoyed it, and found myself as a state counsel at the Attorney General's Department in Sri Lanka, which is equivalent to the Crown prosecution here. And that was the start of my legal journey.
That's very engaging to hear. And I mean, I'm sorry to hear about, of course, your family, but thank you. I think that, as we'll find out in this interview today, you're testament to that resilience. I'm curious to know what prompted you to go from, say, you had this sort of prosecutorial background in Sri Lanka to now moving to the UK and starting maybe this corporate role.
Yeah, so the Sri Lankan experience was great because as a young attorney general, state counsel, I would say, in the department, you got to go to different parts of the country, go to courtrooms, and I loved it to feel the dust of the arena. But it also opened my eyes to different areas of the law. So law of the sea being a case in point. Because the department got involved in these various topics that were relevant to the country at large and the marine ecosystems, as you can imagine, for a small island state like Sri Lanka, very important. And so what happened 2 years into my state counsel career was I got a full scholarship to do my master's in the UK. And I came over to the University of Bristol, where I spent 1 year. And in fact, my dissertation was on the law of the sea 20 years ago. And it was a wonderful experience. Bristol opened my world to life in the UK. I had a wonderful cohort of fellow students, and I still keep in touch with the university back in Bristol. And it was opening my world up to different forms of law, whether that be international law, trade finance, and just to kind of showcase that there's a world out there beyond, say, contractual law, etc., which I had dabbled in, or criminal law back in Sri Lanka.
That's very interesting. And I imagine just outside of obviously everything you've learned kind of when you moved to the UK, when you came to Bristol, what was that jump like from Sri Lanka, coming from that more maybe strict, slightly traditional background to now you were all of a sudden free in the UK?
Yeah.
And there's this maybe new culture that you're getting accustomed to. How's that?
Yeah, I would say cultural revelations, yes and no. So no in the sense that coming from a Commonwealth country, the language and cultural norms were somewhat familiar, but there were certainly new learnings. So a couple of examples was, you realized why the English are so obsessed with the weather, right? Because you have 4 seasons in one day, not so much an issue in the tropics. Another example, I learned very soon that if an English person could pronounce my 5-syllable surname, number one, they're probably massive cricket fans. And number two, they probably went to a public school or had private education. And that to me was fascinating because, as with much of South Asia, cricket is a great leveler. And everyone loves and plays cricket regardless of class and creed, whereas in the UK it's slightly different. So these are subtle learnings that I kind of absorbed along the way during my time in Bristol.
That's very interesting to hear, actually. I have friends who have also come from Sri Lanka, and they talk about how cricket is that thing that when they go into interviews, they can kind of find common ground with the cricket. So that's kind of it is kind of a equalizer, isn't it? Yeah. Kind of switching back to then your career and how you wound up here at Simmons. I know you've been at lots of different sort of financial institutions, big corporate roles, and I'm curious to know how those roles shaped where you are today now, being sort of the senior leader in ESG.
So I didn't really map out my career in this way at all. So coming from civil service, I always intended to go back to the department after my master's. The mistake, or perhaps not, that I made was I came to London for a few months, and I was, Vandy, I must confess, utterly seduced by the heady and exciting time, because it was pre-financial crisis and the city was buzzing. And so I found myself being a junior associate at White & Case on Old Broad Street in their private funds team. And I must say, I quite enjoyed it. What I found most revealing or most different was the pace, because the tropics had its charms, but it moves to a different rhythm. And so the city at that point I found hugely exciting to be part of a very dynamic culture, although admittedly the 3 a.m. taxi rides back home were very much the norm rather than the exceptions.
Part and parcel of that London corporate life, is that right? Yeah. Tying into kind of your heritage, does that influence sort of your approach to your career, approach to life, outlook on life?
For sure. So the White & Case experience soon after, I think perhaps I should take a step back to say why I ended up at Simmons doing the role that I did in a way. And that is linked to your question of the cultural background shaping my career. So after White & Case, my first in-house role was Barclays, and I wasn't there for too long before I got headhunted to Morgan Stanley. But it's rather curious now in my Simmons role, I've reconnected with a lot of folks at Barclays, which is wonderful. But at Morgan Stanley, I joined the legal team first, but then moved to the front office in the equities desk. And that business got merged with asset management. So my last role at Morgan Stanley was within MSIP. Now, it's when I was at the equities desks, I first started working in ESG, because I remember that year our ESG-focused client RFPs went up by something like 460%. So it was really exciting to be part of that first wave of initial structuring of what could we do in terms of products and services for clients who actively wanted more exposure to ESG-type products. And the Morgan Stanley experience to me was super informative for a variety of ways, but also because it exposed me to different types, so the sell side versus buy side of working, and gave me a commercial perspective. Now, which brings me to, I guess, your question on culture and how it shaped a couple of ways. So firstly, and maybe I answer that with examples, I have to admit that I had to unlearn a lot of the traditional South Asian conditioning that I went through in Sri Lanka to survive and exist in particularly in the investment banking world. I remember on Monday mornings when I was in the equities floor, there used to be this all hands on deck meeting in the boardroom on the equities sales and trading floor. And I used to be oftentimes the only woman, let alone the only person of color in the room. And in my head, Bandy, I had my mother's voice going, Sonali, don't speak loudly. Sonali, don't interrupt. Sonali, don't rock the boat. And all around me, people, and let's face it, mostly white men, were doing exactly that and more. Yeah. And so I had to battle this internal cultural conditioning to find my own authentic way of being heard and being seen in these kinds of forums. And another example, which was quite funny, and excuse the pun, was on smiling. Now, Bandy, you have a Sri Lankan heritage as well, and you will know that smiling is something chronic for Sri Lankans. And the joke is that we smiled our way through 3 decades of civil war. Now, I got some feedback early on to say I smiled too much and that it impacted my gravitas. Now, I did not know quite what to do with that feedback. Initially, I tried to, have a glum face for a while, but didn't quite work. And I spoke to a few people, senior folks who I respected within the firm. And I came to the realization, look, if smiling compromises my gravitas, then it's probably gravitas I can live without, right? So you've got to figure out, what do you change? What do you retain in terms of being your own person? And I would say the final piece, and this is the most important contribution, which I'm very grateful for in hindsight, to what brought me to Simmons, and this is a very personal assessment, I suppose, is that coming from a developing country like Sri Lanka and having the aspiration of being a civil servant, whilst I'm incredibly grateful and privileged to have worked with very smart people, earn good money, I started asking myself the question, is this all I'm here to do with my career? And to me, ESG was an inspiring way of weaving these threads together. My finance skills, my legal expertise, and sustainability to help clients hopefully pivot towards a more purposeful way of doing business. And for that realization, I'm very grateful.
That's excellent. Now, I have to say, everything you just said, I resonate with so much. From the smiling, I'm both Sri Lankan and Canadian, so I've got from both that. Well, but and also just kind of not wanting to take up space in a room, not wanting to speak up, but not raising your hand for things where your white peers, white male peers, are more than happy to do that. So unlearning and relearning those things is a very good point. So actually, kind of related to that, and then, kind of when you reflect back, just reflect on even just the present, as a South Asian woman in this very senior legal role, having had so many senior corporate roles, how do you view your impact within sort of the legal profession, just wider community overall? And is there maybe a specific accomplishment that you look back on that you think, oh, that's my legacy, or kind of resonate with?
Accomplishments, it's such a kind of a mirage in a way, isn't it, in the wider context of things. But I would say, in my own way, I'm quite proud. I'm quite pleased in a way, and from a personal perspective, to have had the courage in my own way to take risks with my career and to answer an inner calling. Again, it's a very personal journey, but moving from, say, mainstream finance to ESG was a risky thing to do. And some might say still remains a risk given the political volatility we see across the pond in particular. And then moving from, say, a very comfortable in-house role back to private practice to a newly created role as the head of ESG was not a natural or safe career path or decision. And hey, one could say downright insane. And yet I'm so pleased I did do it, because the joy of seeing an idea take form here at Simmons, the ESG brand that we've built at the firm, how we've lent into topics like the blue economy, that being hugely joyful professionally. And then from a cultural perspective, I remember, I think it was Kamala Harris who said her mother mentioned to her, it's great to be the first, but make sure you're not the last. And what I tell myself is, of course, you have the broader challenge, the societal issue, but the way I reconcile it is, if my being here can inspire one other junior brown lawyer to believe that they belong and to stay resolute and stay the course, then I've made a difference. And don't get me wrong, that's not to trivialize the broader picture. The legal sector and indeed our firm, we have much to do, much more progress to make to have a more equitable representation. I think it's about 4%. Asian partners are a mere 4% of the equity partnership in larger law firms in this country. So there's much more to do, and it's important that we continue to lean in and push those boundaries.
Absolutely. No, and I think that, like, as you said, I think that you're doing that just in the role that you're in right now and in the mentorship you've certainly given me and other juniors within the firm. I can say that you are doing that. I think just kind of as a final sort of parting words, I wonder if you have any piece of advice or just an insight into for young South Asian, whether they're lawyers or just other people who are starting out their careers, if you have any advice for young South Asians.
I'm very careful with advice because sometimes it's easier to say it in hindsight, and everyone's journey and experience is lived experience is very different. But if I were to kind of look back at if I were to advise my old self, I would say very simply, believe in your own self-worth. As a swan, you got to work incredibly hard, but don't let anyone make you feel or tell you that you don't belong, because you absolutely do. And in a way, what makes you different is also your key strength. Again, easy to say, but if you are the only brown person in a room and you speak up, people do take notice. So use it to your advantage. And in that spirit, Vandy, next week we have the UN Ocean Conference, and Simmons is one of the few law firms who've been accredited to be part of the conference. And I plan to wear a blue silk sari to the main evening reception. And I've not worn a sari for any work event in the UK before.
Really?
So I would say embrace the difference and wear it with pride.
I love that. I think with that, I have to thank you for your time. This has been such an insightful and inspiring conversation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.